We are really thankful that you guys have come back to hear another session. I will start off by introducing myself. My name is Sam Mesa. I am one of the interns for Sexuality, and I have the honor of leading this conversation with you guys today. Alongside me are the two mentors, Jessie Finney and Lulu Vega. I will be introducing them and then I will pass it on to them if they want to include or add anything else. Jessie Finney, her pronouns, is a prevention specialist with YWCA Clark County Sexual Assault Program. She's been doing community organizing work around violence, prevention, and systemic change since her early college years and is passionate about connecting efforts to dismantle systemic oppression and work towards liberation. She's a white, bisexual, cisgender woman and also a cringy millennial. In her free time, she likes getting happy hour with friends. She's vaccinated, chilling at home with her cats, and watching professional wrestling. Me too. Now I will introduce Lulu Vega. Also, her pronouns, is a community care coordinator at the YWCA Clark County. She is originally from Texas, but moved to Washington to pursue higher education, and then she fell in love with the state and decided to stay. While in college, she worked as an RA where she grew her passion for educating others on issues surrounding sex ed, feminism, and empowerment, leading her to where she is today. She is a proud Mexican American and she is a proud Spanish native speaker. She loves spending time with her 3 cats and reading and watching anything true crime related. Anything you guys want to add?
I think I'm good on my end. Thank you, Sam. Lulu, are your AirPods connected?
No.
Wait, I can hear you.
Okay, I'm in a car for everyone that can see, and I have some cars driving by, so I'll be muted unless I have to speak because my AirPods will not work, but I'm all good if you are, Jessie.
Okay, yeah, I think we're good. I'll go ahead and share my screen.
Hello?
Sorry, I'm supposed to be in Zoom meeting right now.
Oh.
Okay, can you all see my screen?
And you know what? To be honest with you.
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So I'm gonna drop a link in the chat. We're gonna be doing this thing called Jamboard. For those of you that have never used it, it's a thing through Google Docs where it'll allow for you all to be a little bit more interactive in the space without necessarily having to come off of mute or turn on your video. Because I don't know about you all, but the amount of meetings that I'm in that I kind of don't talk or have my video off is kind of high, but like I still want to be able to participate. And so this will allow you all to, we're going to have some like discussion questions throughout, and this will allow you all to participate in that way. If you can see right here where like my little mouse is circling, these things are sticky notes. And so when we have discussion questions, that's how you all can put your thoughts on the paper, and I'll show you all in a second. But yeah, thank you all for being here, especially on a Friday evening, like the weekend of Halloween. When I was a teenager / younger adult, I would not have been here. So props to you all for taking time out of your day and your pre-weekend to be here with us. Also for having Lulu and I. I know that we're both super, super excited to be here. So thank you. But yeah, today we're going to be spending some time talking about sexuality and mental health. And by sexuality, we mean everything that falls under that umbrella. So gender identity, gender expression, sexual orientation, sex itself, and ways that our society can make those things feel really stressful and anxiety inducing when they shouldn't be. And we want to just open up the space to be able to talk about things that typically are marked as like taboo for younger people to talk about, which is silly. So that's what we're going to be talking about today. We're going to start off by doing a land acknowledgement and some community agreements. So a land acknowledgement is just to make sure that we're taking some intentional time at the beginning of this space to acknowledge and honor the land that we're on and the Indigenous peoples who have been caring for these lands for generations. And it's a practice that we do where Lulu and I work at YWCA Clark County. And it's something that we did in partnership with someone named Karen Kameroff, who works with the Cowlitz tribe and their Pathways to Healing program. So I'm just going to take a moment to read through this statement. So YWCA Clark County would like to acknowledge that we are on the lands that were and continue to be occupied by the Indigenous peoples of the Lower Columbia River. The people still exist, practice their cultural and spiritual ways, and continue to live on these lands. Since time immemorial, these lands were honored and respected by the people who occupied them. In acknowledging that the people have continued to remain on or near these lands, it is equally important to acknowledge these lands we are on today remain sacred as they always have. YWCA Clark County also acknowledges that it was 400 years ago that the first enslaved Africans were stolen and forced to participate in the colonization of America and beyond. We acknowledge that institutional racism has deep roots, which are still impacting the Black community today, and the ongoing struggle for reparations inspires our ongoing work. I think it's also important to acknowledge as well that with colonization came the drawing of borders that led to land being stolen from folks who were Indigenous to these lands as well, that led to the United States stealing land that used to be Mexico. And with the creation of those borders led to the spread of violent colonization and white supremacy. So yeah, it's just important to kind of make sure that we're taking time to acknowledge those things, because it helps to, it's like the first step in decolonization and speaking truth to power and acknowledging that a lot of what we're taught in school is not accurate. And that's by design. And so the more that we can speak truth to how this country was actually founded is an important first step in righting those wrongs and dismantling these systems, but it has to be more than just words. So thank you for allowing me the space to do that. Lulu and I also like to use the practice of community agreements. It's another thing that we do where we work. And these are just things that we want to encourage us all to kind of adhere to in this space, because they help to create a space where we all feel supported and able to learn and participate. So we have participate as you're able, but stay engaged. You'll come to realize that Lulu and I are both very relaxed and like not very formal or structured. And so it's okay if all you're able to really do tonight is just kind of listen. It's the end of the week. I'll also say for myself, this week has been wild. And I'm my brain kind of feels like silly putty right now. But like I'm here and I'm going to do the best that I can. And that's kind of all we ask from you all. We encourage folks to speak from their own experience. We understand that many of us come from very shared, similar experiences and might have shared identities, but at the end of the day, we can't speak for other people. And so we just encourage you to speak from your own experience and not assume that just because you have like one experience that that's going to be the same for other people. We support each other in this space. Lulu and I are also both really passionate about building community and building spaces where folks feel connected and supported, especially when it comes to topics that relate to things that are so close to our identities. And so we hope that everyone feels supported and heard and valued in this space. Do some self-care after. In addition to talking about things that are so closely tied to our identities, but are also a lot of the times like shunned within our society, it can be kind of stressful talking about these things and be really heavy. And so we just encourage you tonight and into this weekend to do things that are restorative for yourself. Accountability. This is something that we're also big fans of. When you bring human beings together, there's always a possibility that harm will be caused, right? We all have the ability to say and do things that are harmful, whether we know it or not, or mean to or not. Usually it's because we just don't have the information or haven't learned those things yet. And so we just ask that, and we do this for any space. I'm not saying that I'm concerned that harm will be caused tonight, but just in any space, we just ask that if someone does cause harm, that the person that did cause that harm is willing to listen and, you know, apologize and take that information moving forward. Check in on yourself and your level of engagement. If you're like me and tend to talk a lot, maybe pause and start to give some more space for other people to talk, or don't like just immediately jump in. Or if you have been talking a lot and it's really quiet and you have a thought, lead with like, I know I've been talking a lot. I have another thought. If someone wants to share, I want to make sure that they're given space first. Like we want you to participate, but it's important to be mindful of the space you're taking up. And if you also feel like you're being really quiet, or maybe you aren't sharing like the sticky notes with your thoughts, we encourage you to kind of move out of your comfort zone a little bit and do that. And then the last one is take care of yourself. If you need to go grab food, grab water, go to the bathroom, like please do that throughout. Like you don't have to, we don't want you to feel like you have to be tied to this the whole time. And similarly, like I said, some of these conversations can hit different for people. And so if we're talking about something that feels really personal or brings up some feelings and you need to take a minute, that's also okay. But yeah, those are just some of the things that Lulu and I like to offer up for the space. Okay, so it's important for us to kind of start out with some shared definitions. A lot of terms that fall under like the sexuality umbrella will oftentimes be used interchangeably when they're actually quite different. And a lot of the times they do interact and correspond with each other, but not always. And so it's important to kind of start things off with some definitions. So the first one being sexual orientation. So this is a person's identity in relation to the gender or genders that they're sexually attracted to, right? So a good way to think about this is like, what are the genders you find yourself having crushes on, right? And that's generally what your sexual orientation is. So that's things like straight, gay, lesbian, bisexual, pansexual. And then from there we have gender identity. So this is your personal sense of your gender, right? And it can correlate to the assigned sex that you were given when you were born. So sex is female or male, and it's generally based off of our body parts, right? Our reproductive body parts. So generally when a baby is born, if it has a penis, it's dubbed a boy, right? And if there's a vagina, it's dubbed a girl. And for some people, when they grow up, they feel like their gender identity is that, right? So for example, I'm cisgender. So when I was born, the doctor was like, this is a girl, right? Because she has this body part. And as I grew up, I did identify as being a girl, right? Like, so I'm cisgender. That doesn't always happen though, right? Like some people are born and they're told you're a boy because you have this body part. But as they're growing up, like mentally, emotionally, physiologically, they don't identify as a boy, right? And those are folks who are known as being transgender, right? And so what the point of this is that there's so many different gender identities than just boy and girl, right? And that's going to be kind of a theme for tonight, is like fluidity, and that there's more than just binaries. Also, if you all have questions throughout, feel free to come off of mute or put your questions in the chat. I know that I tend to talk kind of fast, and I also know that if this information is new for folks, it can be kind of confusing and overwhelming, and that's okay. Like there's no shame in that. So please feel free to ask questions. Or
Jessie,
if you're like, oh yeah.
Yeah, if someone has a question, I can read it out to you. I'll be peeking at the chat while you're talking.
Perfect, thank you. And also, I also recognize there's probably people in this space that know a lot about this stuff too. And so if you're like, I don't like that definition, or I have a different definition, please feel free to share that as well. And then from there we have gender expression. So this is the way in which a person expresses their gender identity, and it's typically through their appearance, their clothes, their behavior. And this doesn't have to necessarily correlate with your gender identity or your body parts, right? Like sometimes all these things go together, and for some other people, they don't, and that's okay. So for example, I identify as a cisgender woman, right? Again, so I was told my parents were told when I was born, this is a girl, right? Because of the body part she has. As I've grown up, I definitely identify as a woman, right? However, I usually dress like a teenage boy, right? And all of those things are okay, right? They don't necessarily have to correlate. And for some people, they do, and that's also okay. Okay, so this is just a visual that we like to use because it helps to kind of map out the fact that there's a spectrum to these things, right? So that's why there's arrows. It's not just one or the other. And also that, again, sometimes these things aren't necessarily connected, right? There aren't just people who are cisgender and straight and, you know, look that way, right? Like there's fluidity and there's a lot of different in between. It's not just one or the other. And I personally think that's really cool. I don't really think binaries make a whole lot of sense when we're talking about human beings, because people are usually really complex and fluid, and those things generally change over time as well. So we also have some of the different pride flags and their meanings. These are not all of them by any means, but I think it's important to just kind of stay as up to date as possible with the different identities. I know I often joke, being a member of the LGBTQ community, that we add a new identity and flag every year, which honestly, like I said, I think is really cool. When I was in high school and I was trying to figure out how I identified, we didn't have things like pansexual, and that I identify as interchangeably both bisexual and pansexual. I don't feel like my ability to be romantically, emotionally, or sexually attracted to somebody is dependent on their body parts or their gender. So I also joke that like my dating pool is very vast and broad, but that also means my opportunity for heartbreak is very vast and broad. But just some flags on here that you might not be aware of. So agender is someone that, no, thanks, Sam. I appreciate the laughing emoji. So agender are folks that don't necessarily identify with any gender, right? And that's also one of the more common ones. Like folks are just like, I don't really feel any type of way about my gender. Then we have aromantic. Those are folks that don't really feel romantic feelings for anybody, right? Like it's not really there. And then there's also asexual, and those are folks that don't really feel any sort of sexual feelings towards anybody either, right? So there's this assumption that like everyone wants to fall in love, everybody wants to have sex at some point, and for some people that just doesn't happen, and that's also okay. Bigender, so that means someone who identifies as both male and female. We have demisexual. Those are folks that they need to develop like a really strong emotional bond before they can start feeling sexual feelings towards someone. Gender fluid means that gender fluid and gender queer can oftentimes be interchangeably used by folks, but it depends on the person using them. But a lot of the times those generally mean that their gender identity kind of fluctuates, and sometimes they feel really masculine and sometimes they feel really feminine. Intersex, hold on. Thank you. Intersex are folks that they were born and their body parts are kind of indeterminate. So they don't necessarily have a super clear penis or super clear vagina, which can sometimes happen. And that's also totally normal. I don't know why it says lipstick lesbian, but I wasn't able to find another really solid chart, but the pink flag is for folks who identify as lesbian. Non-binary, again, are folks that kind of don't subscribe to the typical male-female gender identity. And then pan and polysexual can also be used interchangeably a lot of the times, and that's folks who are attracted to several different genders. Again, don't feel like you have to memorize these, but it is, you know, generally, it is a good way to show support for LGBTQ folks. You know, learn about these things and have kind of a general idea of what they mean. Okay. So as I mentioned before, sexuality and gender identity and expression are really fluid and exist on a spectrum. Sometimes we change our minds about these things. Sometimes we feel differently over time. And a lot of the times when folks, you know, maybe they identified as straight for a while and, you know, only dated members of the opposite sex and gender, and then, you know, realize like maybe I'm interested in different genders. And then like you start dating people of different genders and like people in your life are like, this is just a phase, right? Or like you've always dated people of the opposite gender. So like for me, when I came out to my family as being bisexual, and I have a very supportive family now. When I first came out, there was a lot of confusion and both of my parents were like, well, you've always dated guys. And I was like, first of all, that you know of. And second of all, a lot of that is because like I was conditioned and kind of brought up and taught that like that's the gender that I'm supposed to date. Like I didn't feel like I knew how to go about dating people of different genders than just men. And so if anyone on here has felt that way, where you're like, I feel like I can't come out because I've only like expressed my sexuality in this way, or I've only expressed my gender identity in this way, and it feels weird to suddenly switch. That's a super normal feeling. I'm sorry that it's a super normal feeling because it shouldn't be, but you're not alone in that. And most people experience that if they are exploring their sexuality or gender identity. It's also important to note too, binaries, so this either or, gay or straight, man or woman, these things are products of colonization and white supremacy, and so is homophobia and transphobia. We know that Indigenous communities have acknowledged different genders and different sexual orientations and different sexual identities and celebrated those things prior to contact with white Europeans and prior to contact with colonization and prior to contact with like what we know as Catholicism and Christianity, right? Not saying that those things are bad, but like those things are used as tools of control, right? And to kind of put people in these boxes. And so that if people move outside of those boxes, we can dehumanize them and other them. And so they were used as tools of control and tools of white supremacy. And that's what, at that point, they become bad things. And so it's important to acknowledge that like these things just didn't come out of nowhere. And they also haven't been things that were typically thought, right? Like they came from a very specific place and a place based within wanting to control non-white populations. And also like it's okay if you aren't super sure how you identify right now. Like when you're a teenager and a young adult, you're still developing your sense of self, right? In every sense. And many of us will change our sense of self and like who we are during this age group. And that includes our sexuality and our gender identity and our gender expression. A lot of people feel like they aren't allowed to explore those things and have them be fluid. Otherwise it's like fake or it wasn't real. And again, that's just a part of that binary thinking. And so you heard it here, it's okay. Like, and all of the ways that you feel are valid and they don't have to follow this like direct path. Like a lot of the times as we're figuring these things out, it's kind of all over the place. And they're especially going to be all over the place if, oh, go ahead, Lulu, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just gonna say how Jessie was saying that things change over time, right? I grew up only feeling like I had the space to be straight. Not that anybody ever told me that I couldn't be that I could be anything else or couldn't be anything else, but that's just kind of the feeling that I always thought. And it wasn't until college that I began thinking like, oh, well, like, what are these possibilities? What are these other, like how would I be in these other types of relationships? And even then, like, I'm with a partner who's a male and is cisgendered, and I still very much identify as straight, but still in my head, I'm like, that's not the right fit. But do I feel like it's enough to claim another identity? So I think like, even as you get older, like this, I don't want to say it necessarily doesn't get easier, but it always changes, right? And I think like being aware that you can claim an identity and you can unclaim it at any moment when you decide to is also like very important, because it's something that even at 24 years old, I'm like, oh no, I got myself. I still feel myself battling with, right? Like, oh no, I'm straight. So if somebody asks me, I'm straight, but if my partner asks, or somebody asks my partner, he's like, oh no, she's probably not straight. So it's like, you're battling it every day. Like, what do I want to put out to the world? And then if I say I'm not straight and then I change my mind, is someone going to turn around and be like, oh, you're lying, you were straight all along, and then it creates more damage. So like Jessie said, it's okay if you're not sure. I'm not sure. And I think that you can never be 100% sure.
Thank you, Lulu. That's such a good example. I mean, and that's kind of, again, like the beauty of this conversation is like, no matter what your feelings are, they're valid, right? Like, if you feel like 100% solid and you're like, I have no doubt whatsoever in my sexual identity, in my sexual orientation, in my gender identity, that's great, right? But also, if you don't feel that way, that's also okay, right? And that's kind of what we want to normalize in this space is like, no matter where you're at in all of this, it's okay, right? And like, you have support and folks will validate that. And unfortunately, because of the way of the world, you're a lot of the times going to run into like the opposite of support and validation. But we want folks to know that like there is support and validation out there. So our society really strays away from talking about sexuality, gender identity, and sex with young people. It's just looked at as like, you don't talk about that with young kids. Like I used to do a lot of stuff in the high schools around like sexuality and consent and boundaries, and I would oftentimes be met with complaints from parents that were like, well, if you talk about sex with teenagers, they're going to have more sex, which is actually opposite of the truth. When you don't talk about something, usually young people are more interested in it and want to try it more. But when you're not giving them the opportunity to like learn about those things and how to do them in a healthy way, they're going to be doing those things without the information that's helpful in doing those things again in like a safe and healthy way. And there's also a lot of pressure to have sex, right? Like, especially when we're in high school and in college. And a lot of the times people participate in those things before they feel ready because of that pressure. And actually having conversations about sex and sexuality leads to feelings of empowerment and waiting until you are ready. I'll get off my soapbox with that. But it is like, it sucks. Like, our society doesn't create spaces for us to have these conversations because there's like this tension and people get really tense about it. And it makes navigating all of these things really stressful and overwhelming and like anxiety inducing. I remember like navigating all of these things before I had access to all of this information. I was like, I have no idea what I'm doing, and this feels like really big and scary, but I feel pressured to know these things, know how to do these things. And like, that's just, it sucks to be in that place. And so what Lulu and I are hoping is that this becomes a space where that kind of falls away, and folks do feel like they can talk about these things. So we're going to start by doing some of these sticky notes. The next few slides are going to be some general questions, and then we're going to pivot into talking more specifically about navigating these things culturally, and Lulu's going to lead that one. But like I said here, you just click on the sticky note, and then you can add your thoughts, and then you just press save, and there's my thoughts. So do you feel like you can talk about adults in your life about sexuality? I said heck no, because I absolutely did not feel like I could when I was a teenager. I'm 28 years old, and like I don't want to talk about sexuality with my parents. But yeah, go ahead and add your thoughts. Oops, sorry. So we have some adults, ... maybe not really. And then also, if you for some reason are able to access this, or like maybe you're on your phone, feel free to come off of mute or put your answers in the chat as well. That's totally fine. You have never. Yes, I will send the link again. There you go. So I'm seeing a lot of no. Okay, adults that aren't my parents. Yes. I think that's super, super valid. And I got told that a lot when I was teaching my classes, that it felt more comfortable talking to an adult that wasn't directly your parents. Yeah. Yeah, so definitely we're getting like resounding no's. And I think that's okay, right? Like, even if you have the most supportive, wonderful, understanding parents in the world, it can oftentimes feel a little strange talking about this with your parents. And I think that's okay. So we have a question, what's the difference between agender and non-binary? Yeah, so being non-binary means that you don't identify with either of the gender binaries. So you don't identify as male or female. Agender means that you don't identify with any gender, right? So being non-binary means that you might identify with some genders, right? But remember, like, there isn't just male or female. So non-binary folks fall within the spectrum of kind of wherever, right? And a lot of the times that can fluctuate. Whereas agender folks are like, I don't really feel any kind of gender, right? Like, I have one friend that identifies as agender, and they say, I just kind of vibe and exist, right? Like, my existence doesn't necessarily correlate with a gender, right? Let me know if that doesn't make sense. And again, like, the thing that I also tell people is, like, it's okay if you struggle to really fully understand gender identities that aren't your own, right? You might not, and that's because you don't experience that, right? And like, that's okay. But the thing I always tell people is you don't have to fully understand something to still respect that person's ability to like exist and identify that way. Thank you for the question. Okay, so yeah, this I think is generally a shared feeling that like it doesn't necessarily feel super comfortable to talk to adults, or maybe like specifically your parents. So I also see older friends. So that's why like it is important to have a support network where you do have adults or older people that you feel like you can talk to about this. I do see one yes, that's fantastic. I'm very happy for you. All right, the next one is, do you feel like there's access to good sexual education in your schools that specifically highlights things like gender identity, different sexual orientations, consent, healthy relationships? Like, do you feel like sex ed is helpful right now, at least the way that you're currently able to access it? Go ahead and add your thoughts. One thing that I realized when I was working in the high schools was that it was really inconsistent, and I don't think sex ed was required either. And so some students did sign up for it, but it wasn't like required. And then the type of sex ed that you got in terms of like the quality of it depended on the teacher that you had. So this person says, I learned more from my English teachers than in health class. Yeah, like, so again, like really inconsistent. So we have, yes, I think so.
Someone on the chat said, yes, I think.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. So again, like kind of inconsistent, and it kind of depends on the school you go to, the teacher you have. They also only focus on straight sex, never anything else. Yeah. I've also heard that too. Which really is like, that really creates barriers for non-straight youth to be able to learn about healthy sexuality, right? So I heard somewhat helpful. Okay. Yeah, and I think I've definitely heard that in some aspects it's gotten better than when like I was in high school, because I didn't have sex ed at all. Lulu is from Texas, and Lulu didn't get any at all.
I can say and my teacher, I remember her name was Miss Perkins. She had ripped out the pages of the health book of everything that didn't say abstinence. And this was in middle school. So I'm 24, so it's been a while, but I clearly remember her being like, oh no, we're skipping that part. We're not talking about that. And so I told Jessie about this. I actually didn't know what a condom looked like until I came to Washington my freshman year. And as a girl alone in a place, in a college town in Pullman, it was something that I really like had to face. Like, how did I get here and do not know like the most basic of things? And now I'm thrown into a university where this is normalized, right? This is what everyone's doing. And how am I supposed to engage in this culture if I know nothing about it? And I'm not equipped to even try and handle anything that's coming my way. So my experience with sex ed was non-existent. I didn't have any until I was in college.
Yeah. And like that, again, it makes navigating these things feel really stressful and anxiety inducing when these are all like really natural human things, right? That like when done safely and in a healthy way and like with consent and like everyone's on board is like, you know, something that's really cool, right? And like a part of just being a human. Not just sex, but like identifying our gender identity and like exploring who we are as people, right? Like those are all really basic parts of being a human, but there's something that, again, like there's this stigma attached to it. So yeah. What do you wish was included in sex education? Like, what do you wish you had, what information do you wish you had access to more easily? How to practice safe sex realistically. I think that's also very, very valid, right? Like, it's important to normalize conversations about like, how does this actually happen in real life, like in practice, right? And the same thing that applies to also conversations around safety and consent. Like one thing that I really tried to talk about in the classes that I taught around consent was like, how does this actually look like in practice in person, right? Because a lot of people are like, so what, do I just like literally have to ask like every single thing, right? So like, what does that actually look like in person? Grooming, yes, absolutely. So it's also important to talk about like ways that people can be harmful sexually, right? Like ways that people can cause harm sexually. That includes like, again, going back to safety and consent, but also what does grooming behavior looks like. And for folks that might not know, grooming is when there's a power dynamic in a relationship, whether or not that's age or who that person is in relation to the other, and like treating them in a way that's normalizing abusive behavior, right? And making them, a lot of it has to do with like isolation and manipulation. So yeah, absolutely. Ways to take care of sexually transmitted diseases. Yes, I was 26 years old when I learned that most STIs and STDs do not have symptoms. So that means I was 26 years old, y'all. Meaning that that's why it's so important to go get tested, because a lot of the times you can have an STI or an STD, which are also incredibly common. We have a stigma associated with those things, and it kind of sucks because it makes people who do get them feel like dirty and there's something wrong with them, and that's not the case. But yeah, like having more normal conversations around those things. Kinks, lots of people have them, and shame is constant. Yes, 100%. 100%. Wish they stopped making it seem not normal to do that stuff or inappropriate, bad to be curious. 100%. And this is, we're going to transition into Lulu's section now, and she's going to spend some time talking about like shame and guilt and navigating those things. You can check the chat. Changes which can occur after sex, first time though. Yeah, 100%. Absolutely. All right, Lulu.
Okay. So the way that I kind of formatted this was, I wanted to take everything that we talked about with Jessie and then kind of put it through a lens of our culture, right? And just kind of get the conversation going, because this is something that I took a long time to realize, right? Why it is that I didn't have the education. What influenced me? Was it my parents? Was it my culture? Was it just because my school didn't have it? So that's kind of where these questions are going. And most of them are like the questions we were just answering, where you have to put up what you think. You can put it up on the chat or not. So do you think that your Latinx culture has an impact on any aspect of your understanding of sexuality or sex ed? So do you think that you being a Latinx individual has had any impact on what you know about these topics? Okay, yes. Yes. Wrong to be liked or attracted to the same sex and gender. And I think that that's something that's very popular in Latinx culture, right? Specifically speaking, I'm Mexican, and that's something that even till today, it's very hard to communicate to your family if you're not straight. Let's see, it said wait until marriage concept. Definitely. My household, there was a you don't move out until you're married, right? So marriage is like this big thing that it's like you're coming of age. Like once you're married, you can do anything. Once you're married, you can have sex. 100%, especially if you come from a religious background. Yep, you're right. I think a lot of Latinx values stem from religion, and so we kind of guide ourselves by these rules, like how Jessie was saying, right? It's a way of them controlling what we do, who we are. Never talking about sex at all. Hush, hush. Yep. And a lot of this, as you guys can see, it's kind of like the questions that Jessie was asking. We're doing the same answers, right? At saying the same things, but it's true. Even to this day, my mom will try and talk to me about sex, and I'm like, oh, yikes! No, mom. Like, I don't want to hear this. Yes, because of machismo. That's a big one, I think, in Latinx culture, right? Women are typically looked down upon. We have to listen to what men say. And it's like sex is for men, right? Men can talk freely about sex, women not so much. I know growing up, my brothers could say things, like say sexual jokes, could say anything, penis, vagina, anything, but I couldn't. I wasn't allowed to. It was inappropriate because I was a lady, but it was okay for them. Okay, do you want to go to the next slide, Jessie? Oh, I got another one. Having several sex partners is looked down upon. Having an active sex life. That's right. And if you realize everyone has sex, right? I'm like, this isn't something that like only some underground people are doing it. Your parents had sex to have you. Their parents, my mom had 5 kids. I'm like, at least 5 times she had sex. I'm like, but how is it? And it's 2 different partners. So it's like, how is it that it's okay once it's already happened, but we can't normalize talking about it, right? We can't normalize like, oh, you might have multiple partners and you actually might have sex just to have sex, not to have children. It's not just to serve that purpose. Okay, do you want to go on to the next? Do you feel like you can talk about sexuality openly within the Latinx community? Definitely not. Okay. Let me see. Yeah, no. Unless it's the younger generation, older generation, no. Let's see if I can move these. And so why, and you guys are free to add it on there, why do you think that you don't feel comfortable? Culturally speaking, right? Like, is it because of the judgment that they have, the preconceived notions? And I can speak a little bit on this. Just, I went home to Texas just a couple days ago, and I had this conversation with my niece that she came out as queer, and she was like, oh yeah, my grandma knows. So my mom knows. And I was like, oh, I don't think my mom knows. And she's like, no, I'm pretty sure she knows. And so in the middle of dinner, I was like, Mom, do you know that Chostan's queer? And my mom was like, no. And like her face fell, right? And it was because she thought all along Chostan was joking, right? Because how would Chostan ever talk so openly about this if it wasn't a joke, right? So the only way that talking about it was okay was if it was a joke. And so she took it as a joke. And so I think that it's not like one of like these really big examples, but it kind of like hit home for me. Like I was like, oh yeah, we only ever say like, oh, you're gay, oh this, right? And especially speaking in the Latinx community, it's something that's very prevalent, right? If it can't be real, it must be a joke. And so much so that my mom thought, oh, for sure, it's a joke. And so essentially Chostan was outed in the middle of dinner because my mom couldn't wrap her mind around the fact that when someone tells you, hey, grandma, I'm queer, it's not a joke, right? It's real. Someone put older generation, no. They use God created men and women only. R.I.P. You know, I think that one is really hard sometimes because you feel like your family actually believes this, right? So if your parents are telling you like, oh, no, God created so-and-so, how can you come and say, well, actually, I think something else. Actually, I don't think that God did that. You know, it's a very hard concept to kind of go against. And I've personally have felt it. I've had countless of conversations with my mom about it where I end up upset or crying because I'm like, how could you say like God created this, blah, blah, blah. Said because of family expectations of having kids and stuff like that. I think that that's something, right, that I just talked about too, that we're not just created to make kids, right? At my age, my mom had 3 kids already. I have 0. I have 3 cats. Like, we're more than just baby making machines. Like, you know, like you can enjoy sex, you can enjoy not having children. And I think that it's a hard concept for other people to grasp within the Latinx community. Like, hey, actually, I want more than just having kids, right? And it ties us back to machismo and to that idea that we're there for men, to provide for men, right? Okay, do we want to go to the next one? Okay, so I think kind of what out of these 2 questions, kind of the the gist of it was like, yeah, no, right? I don't feel comfortable with it. And Jessie talked about it in the beginning, taboo. And that's right. That's why we don't feel comfortable talking about it. Not talking about a subject creates taboo, and then it only reinforces that same cycle, which we won't talk about it more, makes it even more taboo. And then we won't talk about it more, and it's even more taboo, right? And so for those of you that don't know, the definition of taboo is not acceptable to talk or do. And I think that we all agree that sex and sexuality and identity is something that it's not, that you can't just walk into any place and feel safe talking about, right? You kind of have to read the room, know who you're talking to in order to feel safe doing it. But this taboo, what it only creates is misinformation. So for example, me not knowing how to use a condom, right? That was misinformation, because if I would have gone to go have sex with someone and didn't know how to use a condom, didn't use it appropriately, well, now I'm pregnant, right? And so now I have a whole set of problems that come along with misinformation, with thinking that only abstinence was the way. Taboo also creates toxic societal beliefs, right? So how some of you were saying that believe that we are only here to make children, right? That sex is only here to make children, machismo. That idea that we're here for men's pleasure, that idea that God created men and women, and that's the way it's supposed to be. And so these toxic beliefs then bleed into who we are, what we think, and how we relate to others. Because even though you might not feel like you identify as gay, what if your friend does? You have all these beliefs already in your head, right? And it bleeds through people, right? This isn't something that you just keep within yourself, just the way your parents didn't just keep these thoughts and beliefs within themselves. So I think it allowing taboos to happen just creates more problems in the long run. And somebody said shame and guilt, and I think that that's also a big one, right? You're shameful that you had sex. It's shameful that your parents found out that you had sex. You're dirty. You're not a virgin. You're not that perfect child, right? When my parents found out that my mom found out that I had sex, it was like, oh my gosh. When she found out I had moved in with my partner, I was like, oh my goodness, like, how could you? Like, don't tell anybody from church because they're going to think wrong of you. And so all of these things that carry heavy on you, right? Because I didn't want to tell anybody that I had moved in with my partner, and then my partner's like, well, what's wrong? Like, right? So it's these toxic beliefs that then you put them onto other people and affect other people. If you want to go on to the next one. Okay. What are some popular thoughts your parents or others in your community may have about sex or sexuality? And it's kind of like redundant here, but I'm trying to really like get through to you guys of the connection, right? There's these things that, although your experience is different from everyone, it's kind of very alike, right? Like my mom said, you wait till marriage to have sex, right? This purity thought, and I'll write that one down. Yeah, we can't have sex until we get married, right? It's not appropriate. You can't do that. Only have one lifelong partner. Like I said before, my mom didn't have one life partner, right? But she expects me to have one life partner. So it's these expectations. It should only be between a male and a female. Someone said on the chat, my parents always say no sex before marriage. And anything besides vanilla sex is gross. And I think that goes back to the whole normalization of kinks, right? And what we believe normal sex is, because what is normal sex to them? It's heteronormative, heterosexual sex, right? You're not talking about anything other than a penis and a vagina and then getting it done with and taking a nap, you know, like, and waiting for the baby to come. Like, that's what it is to them. Those were some good ones. I didn't even think of that one. Okay. Let's see. Do you want to go on to the next one, Jessie? Then where do you think these thoughts and the taboo that comes along with it is rooted from? Culture, right? Religion, generational beliefs, right? It's been passed on from generation to generation, right? Your parents only know what their parents taught them, and your grandparents only know what their parents taught them, right? So we're passing on information, and if we don't take it upon ourselves to create an environment where education and information is readily available, we're going to continue passing on these same false beliefs, the same toxicity over to our children, who are going to keep believing these same things, not knowing. My parents do tell us children came from heaven when we were much younger. Oh, that's a good one, right? So not even talking about where actually children came from. They came from heaven. And that negates the whole idea that sex even exists and that sex is even something that people engage in, right? Uneducated, whether it's never being taught or learning things that aren't true. Because if you think about it, where are your parents getting their information from? It could be porn. It could be what they talk to their friends, right? To your parents' friends. My mom calls them like comadres. Like, what did the comadre say? Or is it from jokes, from sexist jokes? Is it from what their grandma or their mom told them? Yeah, you can go ahead and hit the next one. And so I think you guys really were able to kind of hone in on what the purpose of these questions were. Our culture influences everything we think, we say, we do. It's not something that we just live in and has no effect on anything, right? Every day of my life, I've had to deal with what my mom taught me, have had to deal with what others expect of me as the Latinx women in America, right? So this culture is always there, and really being able to understand that the culture is what kind of rooted, where everything kind of was rooted in. This also allows us to make the right decisions for ourselves, right? Once I realized that my uneducation was not because I chose to be uneducated, was not because my mom chose for me to be uneducated, then I was able to seek the information that I need. And I was able to work towards getting rid of a lot of the guilt, right? That guilt that you can't have sex for fun, that guilt that you can't talk about sex, right? The guilt of, oh my goodness, what if I get pregnant? The guilt of, am I straight? Am I not? And so all of that, you're able to work through once you know where it's coming from. Once you are able to detect, like, hey, like, I know a lot of this is rooted in my culture. I know a lot of this can be unlearned just the way that it was learned in the first place. I think someone said on the chat, I think they got their thoughts from their grandparents, like a generational thing. And yes, I think so too. It's something that is just passed down, right? And then we have to take it upon ourselves to kind of break that cycle, break that curse a bit here. All right, you can go to the next one. And I don't know what happened there, but it's no one's fault. And so you can see that I tried doing an X, and then I don't know what happened with all those markers, but it's not your fault. It's not your parents' fault. And although a lot of this conversation seems like it is, right? It's not their fault. Really, they only know what they know, and they don't know what they don't know. It's really our society as a whole that has caused this, and that we have allowed it to happen, right? It's the fact that we have engaged in an environment that allows for us to be uneducated. If we look at laws that pass, they're not there, and they're not in effect for us to be educated on these topics. In fact, I would even say they hinder us learning on these topics, right? Like the Texas ban on abortion, a huge thing. I'm from Texas. I took that very much to heart. I was like, oh my goodness, like how are we going to move forward, right? How are we going to do something about unwanted pregnancies because of lack of education when you're even stopping us there? So it's not something that it's anybody's fault alone. It's something that collectively as a society has been allowed to happen. And once you're able to do that, then you can also engage in conversations with your parents, because then you don't have to cast blame on them. And they don't have to feel guilty, like, oh, my child doesn't know about this because of me, but it can be a more conducive conversation. And I know when Jessie and I were preparing for this, Jessie said, well, and sometimes parents don't even want to talk about it, and they don't feel comfortable. And I think that that's also important to know, that if your parents really don't want to talk about it and they're not comfortable with it, it's okay to acknowledge that. But then it's also important for you to find a good source of getting that information, right? A valid source, not just pornography, not just what your friend told you or what your older friend told you, right? Something that's accurate. Okay, yeah, awesome. And then what are some ways that we can normalize the subjects we talked about today? Because really normalizing these subjects are the only way, it's the only way that we're going to be able to move forward and be able to be educated and talk about it with your parents and have correct information, right? And so it's at combos like this, social media. I think social media has really stepped it up in this aspect. I follow a lot of accounts on sex ed, which I think are amazing. It allows you to do it in a passive way where nobody's watching you, right? It's on your phone. You don't have to tell anyone like, hey, this is what I'm looking at. So it's at your own pace. Update the sex ed curriculum. Yeah, right. I'm not from here, so I don't know what the sex ed curriculum looks like here in Washington, but definitely in Texas, right? Add those pages back in. Make sure that people are teaching, the teachers are teaching what they're supposed to be teaching, and if not, make it part of the curriculum. Try talking to our parents about it and let them know what we think, right? If you don't have a conversation, you're never gonna know. Readdress the sex ed system. Learn to educate yourself by researching. Unfortunately, that's very true, because a lot of these conversations don't happen. We have to take it upon ourselves, right, to figure out where to get this information from. Make sure to not instill these harmful ideas to the future gen or even future kids. And I think that actually that is a great thing. I think you now know what you don't know, right? And you're able to make educated decisions. You're able to move forward and be cautious of what it is you say. You know why you say it, you know why you feel that way. And you can still feel those ways, right? I can feel like I don't know what I identify as, but I know where that's rooted from. Therefore, I don't have to feel guilt that I'm not straight, right? I understand that I question things and I can't make a decision because of how I was brought up, but I'm also okay with that because I'm able to to understand where that feeling is coming from. So I think it is very important for you to know where these thoughts, where these ideas are coming from, and make sure that you don't pass them on to your future kids, future family members, friends, etc. Yep, you can go on to the next. And then I looked up some resources of places that you can go and get some more information. Planned Parenthood, I'm sure a lot of us know about it. They specifically have some teen sex ed information. And so I thought if any of you are wanting to look at some information, that would be a good place. Amaze, I looked at the stuff and some of it's a little cheesy. It's like animated, but I think it also kind of makes the subject a little bit more lighthearted, right? Not as intense. And so I put that on there, amaze.org. They have YouTube videos, they have an actual website, and then they have an Amaze Junior, which is for younger children. So not for teens, for younger children, which I think it's a good resource to have as well. And it's animated. The little doodles are really cute. So, and just always researching your resources too, knowing that these resources, who are putting them out, who is the one benefiting from having these resources up. Sometimes resources look like, oh, this is a great resource, right? And then you get through half of the article and you're like, oh, nope, this is not it. So just being mindful of what you're looking at and how you're using the information, and who you're sharing the information with too. I think that was about my part of it. Right, that is the last slide. Awesome.
Yeah, I think that's all of it. Yeah, thank you all. We have some time left, and so if anyone has, I'll stop sharing my screen. If anyone has any other questions, or there are things that we didn't talk about that you wish we would have, feel free to come off of mute or put those thoughts in the chat. And I don't know, Sam, if you have any additional thoughts, or the way that you all usually close these out. But I just know that Lulu and I are both really grateful for the opportunity to be here. We hope that this was helpful, and a space that you all felt was useful and validating. But yeah, I'll pause there to see if there are any questions, or Sam, if there's anything else that you want to say.
I don't have anything else on my part. Does anybody else have any more questions? Okay, I think there is no more questions, but if Jessie and Lulu want to drop their contact information down in the chat, in case maybe they're shy and they don't want to say it out loud, but they'd like to reach you guys anyways. Also, Rose, would you like them to drop their email, or do you have that?
Actually, yeah, drop your emails, and then I'm also dropping the permission slip / photo release in the chat. You will need to fill that out to get your gift card, so please do that.
So don't forget to fill that out. And I want to thank Jessie and Lulu for leading us through this conversation tonight. So thank you guys very much. Thank you, Rose, for all the background work. And thank you all for attending this session today.
Thank you so much, everyone. Thanks, Rose, for inviting Lulu and I. We've gotten to work together so much this month, and I love it. So
Yes, thank you so much. I was very nervous, so it was good to be here with Jessie. But thank you for having me.
I know, nice to finally meet you, Lulu. We've been corresponding and going back and forth. All right, thanks guys. Once you've dropped your email, you can go ahead and hop off and have a great Halloween weekend.